The bounty notice arrived on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1878, slid beneath the door of the Dusty Spur Saloon in Amarillo, Texas, with a folded $20 bill paperclipped to its corner and a note that read simply, "More where this came from when you deliver her." Calvin Keating picked it up from the floorboards without looking at it for a full minute, because he already knew what it was going to say. Word traveled fast in a town like Amarillo, and the word that morning was that Harlan Greer had lost his woman again. Not lost her the way a man loses his hat in a windstorm, either. Lost her the deliberate way, the kind where the woman packs a satchel in the middle of the night and slips out a back window while the man sleeps off a bellyful of rye whiskey. Calvin set his coffee cup on the bar and unfolded the notice. There was no sketch, which was unusual. Most bounty notices had at least a rough illustration scratched in ink. Instead, there was just writing. Her name, Stella Ramsey, age 26, brown hair, green eyes, 5 feet and 4 inches tall. Last seen heading south from the Greer property on the edge of town. Harlan Greer was offering $150 for her safe return, and he used the word safe in a way that made Calvin's jaw tight, because safe was a word a man chose carefully when he was trying to sound reasonable while meaning something else entirely. $150 was more money than Calvin had seen in a single payment in 6 months. He folded the notice back along its original creases and tucked it into the breast pocket of his canvas coat. He finished his coffee. He thought about the winter he'd just crawled through, living on dried jerky, and the generosity of farmers who sometimes offered a warm barn in exchange for a few days of fence mending. He thought about his horse, a big red roan named Copperhead, who needed new shoes and had a cough that came and went with the cold air. He thought about the $20 already in his hand and the $130 more waiting at the end of a trail. Then he went to the livery, saddled Copperhead, and rode south. He found her tracks within the first mile, which told him 2 things. First, that she had left in a hurry and had not taken pains to conceal her direction. Second, that she had not gone south at all once the town lights were behind her, but had cut east, toward the Caprock and the broken country beyond it. He might have missed the eastern turn if he hadn't been paying attention to the way the short spring grass was bent, and how a single wooden button lay in the red dust at the edge of the road, a small piece of evidence that spoke of a woman moving quickly, not stopping to pick up what she lost. He followed the button east. The land opened up the way West Texas land always did, big and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they do not care whether you live or die. The sky was enormous and pale blue with high thin clouds, and the wind was steady and dry and smelled of sage, and the distant rain that was somewhere over New Mexico and would not reach them. Calvin rode at a steady trot, reading the ground, and by midday he had her trail well enough that he felt confident in it. He found her by mid-afternoon, not because she made a mistake, but because Copperhead smelled her campfire before she heard them coming. She was in a shallow draw carved by a creek that was barely a trickle, crouched over a small fire with a tin cup of water heating on a flat stone. Her brown hair was loose around her shoulders, which surprised him, because women out here almost always kept their hair pinned tight against the wind. She was wearing a plain dress the color of dried grass, a dark wool coat too warm for the day, and boots that were a half size too big for her, which meant she had grabbed what was available rather than what fit. There was a single satchel beside her, dark leather and worn at the corners. She heard Copperhead's hooves on the rocky ground a second before Calvin expected her to, and she came to her feet with a speed that told him she had spent a lot of time being afraid. She had a short-barreled revolver in her hand, a .32 caliber by the look of it, the kind of gun a woman might hide under a mattress or at the bottom of a hat box. It was not a gun that would stop a determined man easily, but it was a gun that could kill him if she was steady, and her hands, he noticed, were remarkably steady. "I know why you are here," she said. Her voice was clear and level and angrier than he expected. "Harlan sent you." "He did," Calvin said. "He did not reach for anything. He kept his hands loose on the reins where she could see them. Then you have wasted a long ride, she said. I will not go back. Calvin looked at her for a moment. The afternoon sun was coming in low over the caprock, and it lit her face in warm gold light, and he could see clearly that she had a bruise along her left jaw that was already turning from purple to the greenish yellow of a healing injury, and another smaller bruise at her right temple that was fresher and still dark. He looked at those bruises and he thought about the word safe again and the way Harlan Greer had chosen it. I did not figure you would, Calvin said. She blinked. It was not what she expected. Then what do you intend to do? She asked, and there was wariness in the question, the kind of wariness that comes from experience, from having asked questions like that before and received bad answers. Right now, I intend to get down from this horse and have some of that water if you can spare it, Calvin said. I have been riding since before sunup. Her grip on the revolver did not loosen, but she did not tell him no. He took that as permission enough and stepped down from the saddle, moving slowly and keeping his hands away from his gun belt. He looped Copperhead's reins around a piece of scrub and walked to the creek and knelt and filled his hat with water and let the horse drink. Stella Ramsey watched him the entire time. He could feel her eyes on his back like a physical pressure. When he straightened up and turned around, she had let the revolver drop slightly, though she had not holstered it. You are not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone who looks more like Harlan's usual company. Calvin had a fair idea what that meant. Harlan Greer kept rough men around him, the kind that looked like they had been assembled from spare parts and hard living. Calvin was not a pretty man exactly, but he was clean-shaven that morning and his coat was decent, and he supposed he did not look like a man who had been hired for cruelty. I am a tracker, he said, not a bruiser. There is a difference. Is there? It was not quite a question. Sit down, he said. Please, I am not going to drag you anywhere. She studied him for a long moment and then carefully she sat back down beside her small fire, though she kept the revolver across her knee. Calvin sat on a flat rock on the other side of the fire and looked at the flames and thought about what he was going to say next. How long? He asked. How long what? How long has he been hitting you? Silence. A long silence, the kind that had weight and texture to it. The fire popped once and sent up a small spiral of sparks. Since 4 months after the wedding, she said finally, and her voice had gone quieter, stripped of its edge, and what was underneath the edge was something much more tired. He was different before, or I thought he was. Perhaps he was never different and I was just too hopeful to see what was true. When was the wedding? 18 months ago, October of '76. Calvin did the arithmetic without commenting on it. 18 months of that. He looked at the bruise on her jaw. Where are you trying to get to? He asked. She looked at him with obvious suspicion. Why would I tell you that? Fair question, he said. You do not have to tell me anything. But I am sitting here trying to work out what I am going to do with myself, and knowing where you are headed might help me figure out the most sensible path forward. The most sensible path forward for you is to take me back and collect your money. The most sensible path and the right path are not always the same road, Calvin said. Another silence. The wind moved through the scrub oak at the top of the draw and made a dry sound like pages turning. My sister, she said at last. Helena. She married a man named Porter Dawes 3 years ago, and they have a farm down near San Angelo. She does not know what has happened to me. I sent her 2 letters in the past year, and I do not know if Harlan let them be mailed. She paused. I want to get to Helena. Calvin nodded slowly. San Angelo was roughly 200 miles to the southeast. It was not an impossible journey, but it was not a small one either, not for a woman alone on foot with a satchel and a .32 caliber revolver and boots that did not fit properly. You cannot make that ride alone, he said. Not safely. I have been managing on my own for 16 hours. You have been managing well, he said, and he meant it. The button you dropped, that was the only sign you left. You made a smart turn east. If I were a lesser tracker, I would have ridden south half the day before I figured out my error. He watched her face carefully. But there are men between here and San Angelo who are worse than Harlan Greer, and some of them ride in groups, and a woman traveling alone with no horse and a short-barreled .32 is going to draw attention she does not want. Are you offering to help me? She made the question sound like an accusation. I am considering it. Why? And there it was, the real question, the one that mattered most to a woman who had learned to be careful about accepting help from men. What would you want in return? Calvin reached into his breast pocket and took out the folded bounty notice and the $20 bill and held them both out over the small fire. I want to give these back to Harlan Greer, he said, except not in person. I thought I would burn them instead. She stared at him. He let the paper catch from the edge of a burning twig. The bounty notice turned black and curled and crumbled, and the $20 bill went up faster and bright. He held both until the heat got to his fingers, and then dropped the last charred corner into the fire. Stella Ramsey watched the money burn with an expression he could not fully read. Something in her face went very still, and then something in it broke open a little, the careful, composed expression cracking at the edges the way ice on a river cracks in the first warmth of spring. That was $20, she said. I am aware. You burned $20. I have also, he said, just voluntarily given up 130 more. I would appreciate it if we did not dwell on the mathematics. Something happened in her eyes then. Not trust, not yet, because trust was a thing that got rebuilt slowly and in small pieces when it had been taken apart thoroughly. But something, a shift, a loosening. My horse can carry two, he said, standing and dusting off his coat. Copperhead is big enough. We can ride until dark and make camp, and I can get you to Helena's farm in 6 or 7 days if the weather holds. And then what? She asked. What do you do when you have delivered me safely? Then I ride on, he said simply. That is what I do. I ride on. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with those green eyes that were more perceptive than he was entirely comfortable with. You do not have anywhere to be, she said. It was not quite an accusation either. It was more like recognition. No, he admitted, I do not. She stood up, picked up her satchel, and looked at him levelly. Then let us ride until dark. They rode until the sun sat on the edge of the horizon like a burning coal, and the sky went the deep dusty violet that preceded the dark. And Calvin found them a campsite in the shelter of a limestone outcropping, where a stand of cedar trees broke the wind. He built a fire and hobbled Copperhead on a patch of good grass, and Stella Ramsey sat across the fire from him and ate the salt pork and hardtack he offered from his saddlebag with the quiet, concentrated focus of someone who had not eaten properly in a while. He tried not to watch her too obviously. It was not easy. She was not beautiful in the conventional way that women in parlors and daguerreotypes were beautiful, not fragile or ornamental or arranged for display. She was striking in a more weather-worn way, the way a good piece of country is striking, the way the Caprock is striking with all that sky above it. There was a directness to her face, a quality of looking straight at the thing in front of her that he found both appealing and slightly unnerving. You have been doing this long, she asked. Tracking people. 7 years, he said. Started doing it for the army out of Fort Concho, mostly following Comanche trails after the raids. After that wound down, I went private. Mostly I track cattle thieves, occasionally runaway horses. He paused. This is the first time I have tracked a person on behalf of someone who wanted her brought back by force. And now you are having second thoughts. I had second thoughts before I left Amarillo, he said. I just needed to see the bruises to confirm them. She touched the side of her jaw with 2 fingers, self-conscious and then deliberately not self-conscious, as though she had decided in real time not to be ashamed of the evidence of what had been done to her. He told people I fell from a horse, she said. Both times. The first time people believed it. Second time I think people chose to believe it because it was easier. Amarillo has known Harlan Greer a long time, Calvin said carefully. And it does not know me at all, she said. I came from Abilene. My father brought me out to Amarillo in '75 after my mother died. He had business with Greer Cattle Business. Harlan Greer was charming and attentive, and my father was pleased with the match, and she stopped, started again. I was 24 and I thought I knew what I was choosing. You did not. No, she agreed. I did not. The fire burned low between them, and Calvin added a piece of cedar and watched the blue flame dance on its bark. "Your father," he said. "Is he? He died last April," she said. "Heart, the doctor said. I think it was grief and too much hard work over too many years, but heart will do as a cause." She said it matter-of-factly, but there was a tenderness under the matter-of-factness that told him it still hurt considerably. He never knew how things were with Harlan, I made sure of that. I did not want his last year troubled by it. Calvin thought about that. The specific kindness of it, the loneliness of it. "I am sorry," he said, and he meant both things, the father and the loneliness both. She looked at him across the fire with those direct green eyes. "You are a strange man, Calvin Keating." "Most people who know me would agree with that assessment," he said. "Is that your given name, Calvin?" "My mother's maiden name, actually. Her family was from Kentucky, the serious Presbyterian kind. She named all her children after old family names. I got off easy. My brother got Thaddeus." A smile. Small, careful, like a wild thing that was not yet sure it was safe, but genuinely there. It changed her whole face. It made him feel something he did not have good words for, so he looked away at the fire instead. "Stella is my grandmother's name," she offered. "My mother's mother. She was a Texas woman, born before the Republic even. She could ride better than most men, and she kept a kitchen garden that could feed 20 people through a winter." She paused. "I have always liked that I was named after her. She was a woman who did things for herself." "She would be proud of you," Calvin said. "Running like this, it took courage." "It took desperation," Stella said quietly. "Courage sounds nobler than what it actually was. It was me standing in the kitchen at 2 in the morning with a bruised rib from where he shoved me into the stove edge, thinking, if I stay here another night, I do not know what version of myself will be left by morning. That was not courage. That was arithmetic." Calvin did not say anything for a while. There was nothing useful to say that would not sound inadequate or hollow, so he just let the silence be what it was, which was a kind of witness. "Sleep," he said eventually. "I will take first watch. We should be moving again by first light." She did not argue with him about the watch, which he took as another sign of her practical nature. She pulled her wool coat tighter around her shoulders and lay down on the far side of the fire and was quiet. He could tell by her breathing when she finally fell asleep, and he sat and listened to the night sounds of the Texas plains, the wind in the cedar, the distant yip of a coyote, Copperhead's quiet breathing from the grass below the outcropping, and he thought about what he was doing and whether it was the right thing and decided that it was, and then stopped worrying about it. The next morning broke gold and cold, with a sharp spring wind that smelled clean. Calvin had coffee ready by the time Stella woke, and she accepted the tin cup with both hands and drank it in silence for a while, watching the horizon lighten. "I want to thank you," she said after a while, "for yesterday. For what you did." "Do not thank me yet," he said. "We have a considerable amount of ground to cover." "Nevertheless," she said, "thank you." He nodded once and went to saddle Copperhead. They rode east and south through country that shifted gradually from the dry red scrubland of the Panhandle toward the rolling hills and oak mottes of the central Texas range. It was beautiful country, the kind that got inside a person and stayed there. Calvin knew this land well from his years with the army, and he pointed things out to Stella as they rode, not to impress her, but because he genuinely could not help himself when it came to land he loved. She rode behind him with her hands resting lightly on the sides of his coat, and they talked through most of the first day, the way people talk when they are traveling together, and the distance between their usual lives makes honesty easier. He told her about growing up in central Kentucky, about coming west with the army at 21, and falling in love with Texas in a way he had never fallen in love with Kentucky. She told him about Abilene, about learning to read from a circuit preacher when she was 6, about her father's cattle operation, and how she had ridden with him on drives until she was 12 and her mother had decided she was old enough to be a young lady and must stop doing such things. "I never entirely forgave her for that," Stella said, "but there was affection in it. the kind you have for people you have lost and can no longer be properly angry at. On the second day, they stopped at a small settlement called Brixton's Crossing to water the horse and resupply from the general store, and Calvin felt a tension come into Stella as they rode in, a tightening of her hands on his coat and a shallowness to her breathing. "Nobody here knows you," he said quietly before they dismounted. "And nobody here knows Harlan Greer. We are just a man and his wife passing through." He felt her consider this and then accept it. "All right," she said. He helped her down from the saddle and they went into the store together, and the man behind the counter was old and incurious and more interested in a newspaper he was reading than in the two of them, and Stella visibly relaxed. She moved through the store with an ease that came back to her naturally, stopping to examine a bolt of blue calico fabric and a jar of preserved peaches with genuine pleasure. "Helena will need something from me," she said, holding up the jar of peaches. "I cannot arrive at her door empty-handed." "That is practical thinking," Calvin said. "It is good manners," she corrected him and put the peaches in the basket. He bought flour and bacon and coffee, and a new tin of matches and a spare blanket, and he paid for the peaches without making anything of it. And when they walked back out into the spring sunshine, he saw her look at the jar in her hands with an expression of quiet, complicated happiness that he thought probably had less to do with the peaches than with the act of buying something freely and for herself. That night they camped near a small creek in a live oak grove, and Calvin tried to teach her how to read the stars for navigation and discovered she already knew the basics. "My father taught me," she said. "He said a woman alone should know how to find north." "Your father sounds like a man I would have liked." "He was," she said simply. The third day brought weather. A spring storm came in from the west in the early afternoon, not the dramatic kind with lightning and walls of wind and rain, but the gray, persistent kind that soaked steadily and turned the red clay roads to orange mud. They found shelter in an abandoned line shack some drover had built and given up on, a single room of rough-cut cedar planks with a functional fireplace and a roof that was mostly sound. They built a fire from the wood stacked inside against the wall and hung their wet coats on pegs near the warmth and sat on opposite sides of the small space and listened to the rain on the roof. The sound of rain on a roof when you are inside and warm is one of the more intimate sounds in the world, and Calvin was acutely aware of this in a way he had not expected to be. "Tell me about tracking," she said. She was sitting cross-legged with her hands around a cup of coffee, her hair drying slowly around her face in the warmth. "What made you good at it?" "Patience," he said, "and paying attention. Most people do not pay attention to the world around them very carefully." They walked through it and their eyes skimmed the surface. A tracker has to read depth, has to see what is underneath what is visible. "Like a bent blade of grass," she said. "Like a bent blade of grass," he agreed. "Or a button in the red dust." She smiled at him. It was easier now, that smile, coming less carefully and settling more naturally. "What else?" "You have to be able to think like the person you are following," he said. "Put yourself in their mind. Ask yourself, if I were this person, afraid and moving fast, what would I do? Where would I turn? What would feel like safety?" He paused. "Following you, the thing I kept thinking was, she is smart, she is not panicking, she is going to do the thing that makes the most sense rather than the thing fear tells her to do. The eastern turn was the smart move. South was obvious, east was intelligent. And yet you found me anyway." "I found you because you are the cleverest person I have tracked in 7 years," he said, "and you were still leaving a trail because you were tired and moving fast. There is no shame in that." She looked at him steadily. "You could have told Harlan you lost the trail," she said. "When you saw the eastern turn, you could have stayed on the south road." "I could have," he agreed. "Why did you not?" He thought about that for a long moment, listening to the rain. "Because I did not want to," he said finally. "I wanted to find you. I just was not sure when I was riding out of town exactly what I was going to do when I did." "And now?" she asked quietly. "Now I am sure," he said. The rain outside intensified briefly, drumming hard on the cedar roof, and then settled back to its steady gray murmur. The fire popped. Copperhead, sheltered in the lean-to at the side of the shack, shifted his hooves on the packed earth. "What does Harlan Greer do?" she said. "When he finds out you are not coming back with me?" "He will be angry," Calvin said. "He will send someone else or come himself. That is why we should not dawdle." "Will he find me at Helena's farm?" Calvin considered this carefully. "He will try," he said. "Which is why when we get to San Angelo, we need to figure out what comes next. A permanent solution, not just a hiding place." "There is no permanent solution," she said, and her voice had gone flat in the way that meant she was trying to be realistic rather than hopeless, but the two things were sitting very close together. "A man like Harlan Greer does not let things go. He has money and he has connections and he considers me his property." "You are not property," Calvin said, and he said it with a flat certainty that was not heated but was entirely unambiguous. She looked at him for a moment with an expression he could not quite categorize. "No," she said, "I am not, but the law does not always agree with that." He knew she was right. The law in 1878 was not generous to women who left their husbands. It was not illegal to beat your wife in Texas in 1878. A man had rights over his household that the courts were reluctant to interfere with, and a woman who fled was in a legally precarious position, not a protected one. Calvin knew this, had thought about it on the trail, and it troubled him in a specific way that went beyond the abstract. "There are ways," he said. "There are lawyers in San Angelo. And there are territories where the situations are different. Colorado, New Mexico, places where a woman can file for a legal separation and have it hold." "You have thought about this," she said, and she sounded surprised. "I have been thinking about very little else for 3 days," he said honestly. She looked at him with those green eyes for a long, careful moment, and then she looked at the fire, and something in her shoulders settled just slightly, just a fraction, the way a shoulder settles when a weight that has been carried shifts to a more manageable position. "Go to sleep," she told him, which was the kindest thing she knew how to say. He did, eventually. On the 4th day the rain had cleared and left the land smelling like fresh grass and wet stone, and the sky was a washed pure blue without a single cloud. They rode through country that was changing, getting greener, the limestone beginning to show through the red earth in long white outcroppings, the oak trees bigger and more numerous. Calvin's shoulder was sore from where he had slept against the wall of the shack, and he rolled it periodically, which Stella noticed. "You are hurt," she said. "I am stiff. There is a difference." "Is there?" she said, exactly as he had said it to her on the first day, and he laughed, genuinely laughed, the unexpected kind that comes out before you can think about it, and she laughed too, and Copperhead's ears pivoted back at the sound as though the horse found it interesting. "He has never heard me laugh," Calvin said. "You said that like you are surprised." "It has been a quiet winter," he admitted. They talked about his winter then. She asked questions and he answered them honestly, which was easier than he expected. He described the series of small jobs that had barely covered his costs, the weeks of cold and solitude, the way he had begun to feel like a man carrying on a long conversation with only himself, all the words circling around inside his skull with no outlet. "Loneliness is a peculiar thing," Stella said. "I was surrounded by people in Amarillo. Harlan's business associates and their wives came to dinner regularly. I hosted church socials. I was never without company." She paused. "And I was the most alone I have ever been in my life." "That kind of alone is worse," Calvin said. "Yes," she said, "it is." Copperhead's ears went forward, and Calvin felt the horse's stride change in the subtle way that meant he had heard or smelled something ahead. Calvin scanned the road and the brush on either side and saw, about a quarter mile ahead, 3 riders pulled off to the side of the road near a struggling mule. He relaxed. One of the riders was a woman. As they drew closer he could see it was a family, a man and woman and what appeared to be an older boy of about 15, all of them working to get a loaded mule back on its feet. The mule had sat down in the road with the conviction of an animal that had made a philosophical decision. Calvin pulled up beside them. "Need a hand?" The man, weathered and honest-faced, pushed his hat back and looked up. "Grateful for any help." This animal decided 2 hours ago that today was not a day for further effort. Calvin swung down, and between him and the man and the boy, they eventually persuaded the mule to stand, which involved a combination of pushing, a twisted ear, and some unflattering commentary on the mule's character and ancestry that made Stella laugh again from her perch on Copperhead. The woman, who introduced herself as Ruth Hennessy, looked up at Stella with immediate frank warmth. "You headed to San Angelo?" "We are," Stella said. "We are going as far as Morrow's Station," Ruth said. "You are welcome to ride with us for company if you are not in a hurry." Calvin looked up at Stella. She looked down at him. There was a conversation in that look, a quick, quiet consultation of the kind that people who have been traveling together for days begin to develop, and they both arrived at the same conclusion. "We would be glad of the company," Calvin said. They rode with the Hennessy family for the rest of the afternoon, and it was one of the better afternoons Calvin could remember in some time. Ruth Hennessy was a talker in the best sense, the kind who had accumulated a vast store of stories about people and places and events, and distributed them freely and with genuine entertainment value. Her husband, whose name was George, was quieter but had a dry wit that surfaced at unexpected moments. The boy was named Sam, and he asked Calvin approximately 47 questions about tracking and the Army and Comanche trails, all of which Calvin answered, because he remembered being 15 and hungry for information. Stella was easy and natural with all of them. She talked with Ruth about preserving and kitchen gardens and the particular challenges of cooking in dry country, and she listened to George's opinions on the cattle market with genuine interest, and she helped Sam with the mule when it decided to express its views on the pace of travel again. Calvin watched all of this from a slight distance and felt something settle in his chest, warm and complicated and new. They parted ways with the Hennessy family at dusk, warmly, with Ruth pressing a packet of dried apple slices on Stella and calling her a lovely young woman, and giving Calvin a look of frank approval that made him straighten his back slightly. "She thought we were married," Stella said once they were riding alone again. "People generally do," Calvin said. "When they see two people traveling together as we are, they assume the natural thing." "Does that bother you?" "No," he said. "Does it bother you?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "It does not." That night they made camp in a cleared area near a limestone spring, and the water was cold and perfect, and they both drank from it before filling the canteens. The spring attracted a great noise of frogs that Calvin found relaxing and Stella found extremely funny. "They are so very loud for such small creatures," she said. "They are very committed to being heard." "I admire that," she said solemnly, and he laughed again, and this time it did not surprise him. She reached into her satchel after dinner and took out a small book. He had not known she was carrying a book. It was slim and worn, the kind of book that has been read many times. "What is that?" he asked. "Poems," she said. "Emily Bront." She turned the cover toward him so he could see it in the firelight. "It was my mother's. I took it the night I left. It was the one thing I was certain I would not leave behind." He thought about her standing in that kitchen at 2 in the morning with a bruised rib, deciding what to put in the satchel. The book, the revolver, the worn boots. "Will you read one?" he asked. She looked at him with a brief, surprised expression, and then she looked down at the book and turned through its pages with careful familiarity, the way a person handles something beloved. She read him a poem about the wind and the moor and something larger than either, and her voice was quiet and even and made the words feel like they had been written specifically for this moment, this fire, this spring in the Texas dark. When she finished, he sat in the quiet that followed and felt the peculiar fullness of it. "My mother used to read poetry aloud after supper," he said. "Kentucky evenings. I have not heard anyone read poetry since." "That is too long," she said softly. "Yes," he agreed. They were getting closer to something. He could feel it the way you feel weather coming, a change in the quality of the air between two people, a new awareness of proximity and silence and the things that words could not quite contain. He was not sure what to do with it exactly. He was not a man who had spent a great deal of time learning the navigational tools of the heart. The fifth day took them through a small town called Palo Verde, where they stopped at the hotel dining room for an actual meal at an actual table, and Stella ordered steak and potatoes and ate every bite with a thoroughness that made him smile into his coffee. She caught him smiling and raised an eyebrow. "I have not eaten at a proper table in 5 days," she said. "I did not say anything. You were thinking something." "I was thinking that you eat with admirable dedication," he said. "I was raised to finish what is on my plate," she said primly, and then ruined the primness by reaching across and taking the last piece of his cornbread. He stared at the empty spot where the cornbread had been. "You were not eating it," she said. "I was considering eating it." "Consideration is not the same as action," she said, and ate the cornbread, and he looked at her face and felt that warm, complicated thing in his chest again, heavier and clearer than it had been before, and recognized it with something between delight and alarm as the beginning of being in love with her. He had been careless about love before, not cruel but careless. There had been a woman in Fort Concho, the wife of a sergeant, who had looked at him a certain way until he had been forced to leave the fort on a lengthy assignment that became a permanent one. There had been a woman in Austin who had liked him well enough but who had been sensible and seen that he was not a man who was ready to stay anywhere and had declined to wait for him to become one. He had understood both of these conclusions and had not argued with them because they were correct. He was not sure what he was now. He was not the same man who had ridden south from Fort Concho at 22 with no particular plan. He was not the man who had ridden into Amarillo on a Tuesday morning, prepared to collect $150 for returning a bruised woman to the man who had bruised her. He was not sure who he was becoming, but he could feel it happening, the way new grass grows under the old brown grass in spring. On the evening of the 6th day, they saw the lights of San Angelo in the distance. Stella had gone very quiet. She had been quiet since the afternoon, when the familiar shapes of the central Texas hills had begun to tell her where she was. He could feel the tension in her body behind him, not fear exactly, but something close to it, the particular anxiety of hoping very hard for something and not yet knowing if it will be there. "Helena does not know you are coming," he said. "No, she may not be there." "She will be there," Stella said. "Helena is always exactly where she is supposed to be. She is that kind of person." They rode into San Angelo in the early dark, through streets that were lively with the end of the working day, horses at hitching posts and lamp light in windows, and the smell of cooking from the hotels and saloons. Calvin asked at the general store for the Dawes farm and got directions that took them 2 miles south of town, down a well-used road that turned off past a cedar fence line. The farmhouse was small and solid and had lamp light in the windows and a well-tended kitchen garden visible in the evening light. A dog came off the porch barking, the friendly kind of bark that is more greeting than warning. Stella sat forward on Copperhead's back with a sharpness that was almost involuntary. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was taller than Stella and had the same quality of direct attention, the same way of looking straight at the thing in front of her. She held a lamp up and peered at the riders. "Stella," the voice went up at the end, uncertain and hopeful. Stella was down from the horse before it had fully stopped, and Calvin watched her run across the yard toward the light, and watched the two women meet in the circle of the lamp's glow, and looked away to give them the privacy of it. He saw to Copperhead. He tied the horse to the porch rail and loosened the saddle cinch, and gave the horse water from the trough beside the barn. He heard, behind him, the sounds of women crying and asking questions and talking over each other and crying again, and he stood with Copperhead in the evening and let them have as much time as they needed. A man appeared from the barn, which was clearly where he had been at the sound of the dog barking. He was solidly built, perhaps 30, with an honest face and the look of a farmer who worked hard and slept soundly and had strong opinions about weather. "Porter Dawes," he said, extending a hand. "Calvin Keating," Calvin said and shook it. Porter looked at the two women on the porch who were still holding each other and talking rapidly. "That is Stella," he said. "It was not quite a question. It is. Helena has been worried about her for months." He rubbed the back of his neck. "Worried is not a strong enough word." "She is all right," Calvin said. "She is going to be all right." Porter looked at him with the kind of assessing gaze that honest men turn on strangers. "You brought her here?" "Yes." "You a friend of hers?" Calvin thought about this for a second. "I am," he said. "I believe I am." Porter nodded slowly and looked satisfied with this answer, which told Calvin something about the man that he liked. They all ate together that night, a late supper of beans and cornbread, and ham that Helena had produced with impressive speed while simultaneously asking Stella approximately 90 questions and crying intermittently. Porter Dawes said little, but watched his wife's happiness with such open contentment that Calvin found it quietly affecting. Stella told Helena the broad strokes of what had happened with Harlan. Not everything, not all the details, but enough that Helena's face went through a series of expressions that ranged from dismay to fury to grief, to a fierce protective love that was something to see. Porter Dawes listened to all of it without interrupting, and when Stella finished he said, simply and with great finality, "You are not going back to that man." And Stella looked at him with a gratitude so profound it was almost painful. Helena put Stella in the spare room that night. Calvin was offered the hayloft, which was clean and warm and had a window that looked out at a sky full of stars, and he lay on his back in the hay and looked at those stars and thought about what came next. He had delivered her safely. He had done the thing he had set out to do, the real thing, not the thing Harlan Greer had paid him for. He could ride out in the morning. He could go back to Amarillo or anywhere else and find the next job and the next road. He had done a good thing. He could leave with a clean conscience. He did not sleep for a long time. In the morning he was up before the house and had the breakfast fire going in the outdoor pit before Helena came out to start it herself. She stopped and looked at him and then looked at the fire and then looked at him again. "Well," she said, "you will do." He was not entirely sure what that meant, but it seemed approving. He and Porter Dawes sat on the porch after breakfast with coffee, while Helena and Stella were inside talking, their voices a continuous soft river of sound through the open window. "What happens when Greer comes looking?" Porter said. "He was not a man who went around a difficult topic." "He will," Calvin said. "He may send men ahead or come himself. He has money enough to hire good trackers." "Can he take her legally?" Calvin was quiet for a moment. "A wife who has left her husband in Texas in 1878 is in a difficult legal position," he said honestly. "The law is not particularly her friend." Porter's jaw set. "Then she cannot stay in Texas." "That is one option," Calvin said. "There are others. A lawyer in town, a good one, might be able to help her file a separation. There have been cases take time," Porter said, "and they take money." "And Greer has more of both." Calvin nodded. He had been thinking about this through the long, sleepless night and had arrived at a conclusion that he was not sure he was going to share with Porter Dawes but found himself sharing anyway, because the man had an uncomplicated directness that made honesty the easiest thing in the room. "There is a lawyer in Tucson," he said. "Arizona Territory. A man named Aldrich who has successfully argued several cases of spousal abandonment due to cruelty and obtained legal separations. The territory law is more flexible than Texas law." He paused. "The journey is significant, but it would put her out of Greer's easy reach while the legal matter is resolved." Porter looked at him. "You have thought about this considerably. I have had several days and very little else to occupy my mind. And you would take her to Tucson." It was not quite a question, and Calvin realized that Porter Dawes was several steps ahead of him and had been for a while. "If she wanted to go," Calvin said. Said Porter Dawes and drank his coffee. He told Stella his thinking that afternoon, while Helena and Porter were in the barn together, dealing with a goat that had gotten itself stuck in the fence in the creative way that goats manage. They were sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the kitchen garden, which was just beginning to show green against the dark earth. "Tucson," she said. Tucson, he confirmed. That is a considerable journey. Several weeks on horseback depending on weather and route. She was quiet, looking at the garden. You know this lawyer, Aldrich? I know of him. He has a good reputation. I can write ahead when we reach El Paso, which has reliable postal service, and have his answer waiting for us by the time we arrive. You have thought this through carefully, she said. I have thought about nothing else for 6 days, he said, which was almost exactly what he had said to Porter and was equally honest. She turned and looked at him directly, the full force of those green eyes. Why, she asked. Calvin, why are you still here? You brought me to Helena. You have done more than anyone could have asked. Why are you still making plans? He looked back at her. The afternoon light was golden on the garden and on her face, and the question deserved a true answer and not a deflection. Because I do not want to leave, he said. Because I have ridden alone for a long time and I have been talking to myself inside my own skull for months, and in 6 days you have given me more to think about and laugh at and admire than in the whole of the winter before. He stopped, started more carefully. Because I would like, if you are willing, to keep riding with you for a while, however long a while you will allow. She looked at him for a very long moment. In the barn there was a sustained vocalization from the goat which the situation evidently warranted. You burned $20, she said. I did, and lost 130 more. I did, and rode 200 miles south, approximately. And now you want to ride 500 miles west. Give or take a few, yes. You are a very strange man, Calvin Keating, she said, which was what she had said the first night by the first fire, and the repetition of it felt like something deliberately chosen. Most people who know me agree, he said, which was what he had said then too. Something shifted in her face, something softened and opened. All right, she said. A while. They left San Angelo 3 days later, on a morning that smelled of fresh rain and cedar. Helena had spent those 3 days feeding them both to a degree that bordered on aggressive, and had replenished their supplies with a thoroughness that suggested she was sending provisions for a much longer journey than anyone had acknowledged aloud. Porter Dawes had pressed a good map of the Western Territories into Calvin's hands the night before, and had shaken his hand in the way that meant more than a handshake. Helena held Stella for a long time at the gate, and Stella held her back, and Calvin stood at Copperhead's head and looked at the road west and listened to them saying things to each other that were not meant for him. Write to me, Helena said, from El Paso. Write and tell me you are all right. I will, Stella said, and when it is resolved, come back. You will always have a home here. I know, Stella said. I know I will. She came to the horse and let Calvin help her up, and he felt the brief warm contact of her hand on his forearm as she mounted, and then he swung up behind her and they turned west. She was quiet for the first mile, the specific quiet of someone processing a departure, and he did not intrude on it. But by the 2nd mile she had turned slightly to say something about the road ahead, and by the 5th mile they were talking again. That easy river of conversation that had become the natural condition of traveling with her. The road to El Paso was a long one, and it was not an easy one. They crossed the Pecos River on the 3rd day at a ford that was higher than comfortable due to spring runoff, and Copperhead managed it steadily while Calvin kept his hand on Stella's arm, and the horse's ears stayed forward and intent. They camped in the desert country west of the Pecos, where the nights went from the Texas spring warmth to a cutting cold that made the campfire a serious necessity rather than a luxury, and they lay on opposite sides of it and talked until the fire burned low. He told her things he had not told anyone in a long time. About his brother Thaddeus, who had stayed in Kentucky and married a schoolteacher, and had 3 children and sent letters that arrived with a regularity that made Calvin's own rootlessness feel more acute by contrast. About the war, which he had been too young to fight in but old enough to see the shadow of, and the way it had changed his father, who had come back from 2 years of fighting in the East, a quieter man than he had left. About the night near Fort Concho, when he had ridden into a camp that had been raided hours before, and had read the ground there with a cold professional attention, and had afterwards sat on a rock for a long time unable to get up. She listened to all of it without flinching and without offering comfort that was not genuine. She had a gift for listening, which he had noticed in her conversations with the Hennessy family and with Helena, but experiencing it directed fully at himself was something different and more significant. She told him things in return. About the way her mother had taught her to sew by having her unpick every stitch that was not perfect and redo it until the work was right, which had given her both excellent sewing and a deep understanding of patience. About a summer she had spent at 14 on her grandmother's ranch south of Abilene, the grandmother she was named for, who had been 78 years old and still rode every morning, and who had told her with great seriousness that a woman's life was her own thing, and she must not mistake it for a decoration on someone else's story. "I forgot that for a while," Stella said, on the 8th night of the journey, which was their second night west of the Pecos. "When I was with Harlan, I forgot that my life was my own." She was quiet for a moment. "He was very good at making it seem like it was not, like I was a piece of his life, an appendage." "That is what men like him do," Calvin said. "They make the world small enough that they are the only thing in it." "Yes," she said, "and the terrible thing is that it works for a while, because when the world is small you stop being able to imagine it large. And now," she looked west where the desert dark was immense and full of stars, "now it is very large again," she said. "Uncomfortably large sometimes, but I would rather have it large." "So would I," he said, and he meant it about the world and also in the private geography of his own chest about her. On the 10th day they reached El Paso. El Paso in 1878 was a busy, contentious, dusty town sitting on the Rio Grande with all the drama of the border behind it and in front of it. The river itself was a line between two countries that neither country treated as a polite boundary, and the town reflected this. A mixture of Spanish adobe and American lumber frame, cantinas and general stores and rough hotels, and at least 4 competing claims to the title of best barbershop. Calvin liked it in the way he liked any place that was honest about its own complexity. They found a decent hotel, the kind that was clean without being fancy, and Calvin paid for 2 separate rooms, which he did without making anything of it, and which Stella accepted without making anything of it either. He wrote his letter to Aldrich in Tucson that evening, carefully and in full, explaining the circumstances and requesting a response in care of the El Paso post office, and carried it to the postal office the following morning. They stayed in El Paso for 4 days, waiting for a response, and the 4 days were a different kind of time from the road. The road had its own particular intimacy, the enforced closeness of shared space and shared purpose. The town was larger and more various, and they moved through it with a freedom that was its own pleasure. He took her to dinner at a restaurant run by a Mexican family, where the food was the best he had eaten since he could not remember when, and she ate mole negro with the same dedicated thoroughness she had brought to the steak in Palo Verde, and they sat for 2 hours talking about nothing in particular and everything in general, and the candle on the table burned low. They visited the market, where she bought 2 yards of blue calico and a tortoiseshell comb that she held up to the light with genuine pleasure. He bought a new pair of gloves, and from a second-hand bookseller with a cart near the plaza, a thin collection of Emerson's essays that he thought he might actually read this time, rather than carrying around as aspirational weight. On the 3rd evening they sat on the small balcony outside Calvin's hotel room, which had a view of the river and the mountains beyond it, the Sierra Madre in the last light turning from brown to purple to a deep extinguished blue. Stella was wearing her hair pinned up for the first time since he had known her, which he found he liked and also missed slightly, the looseness of it by firelight. "I have been thinking," she said. "A dangerous enterprise," he said. She smiled without looking at him, still watching the mountains. "When this is resolved, when the legal matter is done with, what does a woman do after something like this?" "Whatever she wants," he said. "That is rather the point of resolving it." "I know the theory," she said, I am asking about the practical reality. I have no money of my own. My father's estate went to Harlan under the marriage. I have Helena, but I cannot live on my sister's charity indefinitely." She was not distressed as she said this, not in a broken way. She was doing what she did, which was looking at the thing in front of her with clear eyes. "I am trying to plan." "What did you do before Harlan?" he asked. "I kept books," she said, "for my father's business. I have a head for numbers. He always said I was better at the books than any man he had hired to do it. There are any number of businesses in any number of towns that would pay well for a bookkeeper," Calvin said, "especially in the territories where finding literate and reliable people is harder. Tucson has a considerable commercial district." She turned and looked at him then, one of those clear, direct looks. "And you?" she asked. "After Tucson, what do you mean?" "You said you wanted to ride with me for a while," she said. "How long is a while?" He looked at her in the last light of the evening with the mountains behind her, and felt the thing in his chest that he had been feeling for 10 days and had not yet said aloud, and decided that saying it aloud was better than not saying it on balance. "As long as you will have me," he said. Silence. The Rio Grande moved below them, silver-brown in the dusk. "That is a very long time, potentially," she said. "I am aware." "Calvin." She said his name in a way that meant she was serious, that she was not deflecting or playing. "I am not in a state where trust comes easily. You know what I have come out of. I do not know how to. I cannot simply." She stopped, looked at her hands. "Ella," he said, and his voice was quiet and level. "I am not asking you for anything. I am not rushing anything. I am only telling you the truth of what I feel because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve careful management. What you do with it is entirely your own matter." She looked up at him. In the evening light her eyes were very dark. "You are the most honest man I have ever encountered," she said, and it sounded like both a compliment and something more complicated than a compliment. "I try to be," he said. "I was not always. I was careless when I was younger. But I have done a great deal of solitary riding, and solitary riding is very good for self-examination." A small smile. What did the self-examination conclude? That I had wasted considerable time being careful about the wrong things, he said. Careful about convenience and comfort and not being caught anywhere that required staying. Not careful enough about the things that actually matter. She reached out and put her hand on his arm lightly, the way she had in the Picos crossing, and he looked down at her hand and then at her face. "Give me time," she said. "As much as you need," he said. Aldrich's letter arrived on the 4th day, prompt and professional and encouraging. He wrote that the case, as Calvin had described it, was an actionable one under Arizona territorial law, that documented evidence of cruelty could be the basis for a legal separation petition, and that he could have the petition filed within 3 weeks of their arrival. He also noted that he was aware of Harlan Greer's reputation and had handled similar cases before. Stella read the letter twice and then folded it with care and put it in her satchel beside the book of poems. "Then we ride to Tucson," she said. "Then we ride to Tucson," he agreed. The journey from El Paso to Tucson took them into country that was entirely different from the Texas plains, the Chihuahuan Desert, and then the Apache country of southern New Mexico and the Arizona border. Big, open, dry country with mountains rising abruptly from the flats in every direction, the colors of the rock running from cream to deep red to nearly black. Calvin had ridden through this country before, but it was different now, traveling at the pace of observation rather than urgency, and he pointed things out to Stella, and she pointed things out to him, and between them they looked at the same land and found it inexhaustible. The question of Apache was a real one. The years of conflict were not entirely resolved, and there were reports of Chiricahua movement in the border country. Calvin was careful about campsites and routes, staying to traveled roads and established water sources, and they encountered no trouble. What they did encounter, near the town of Lordsburg, was a small group of Warm Springs Apache riding north, and Calvin pulled up and held his hands visible and easy, and the riders passed at a distance with a mutual respect that was less hostile than people in the eastern states imagined the West to be, in Calvin's experience. The wars had been real, and the injustices had been profound and were ongoing, and he was under no illusions about the complicated nature of what had happened, and was happening to the people who had been in this land before any European-descended person arrived. He said as much to Stella that evening, and she listened with the full attention she gave to things she considered important. "My grandmother talked about it," Stella said. She had lived in Texas long enough to see the Comanche country become rancher country, and she did not speak of it as simple progress. She said the land remembered what had happened to the people who were taken from it. "Your grandmother sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was the best person I have ever known," Stella said simply. They reached Tucson on a Wednesday afternoon in late April, having been on the road for nearly 3 weeks since San Angelo. Tucson was a proper town in 1878, the territorial capital, with a plaza and established businesses and a hotel that had a real restaurant and a bathhouse attached. And Calvin paid for a week's stay at the hotel, and they both took long baths and ate enormous amounts of food, and slept in actual beds. And the pure physical comfort of this was something neither of them had fully appreciated until they were in the middle of it. Aldrich's office was on a side street off the main plaza, a neat adobe building with a painted sign, and a small waiting room where a secretary worked at a desk, with the intensity of a man who had a great deal to do. Aldrich himself was perhaps 50, trim and silver-haired, with the manner of a man who had spent his career navigating complicated human situations, and had developed an economy of sympathy as a result, warm but not excessive. He met with Stella for 2 hours while Calvin waited in the plaza, drinking coffee at a small open-air stand and watching Tucson go about its business. Wagon traffic and horses and women with marketing baskets and men in business coats, and the occasional soldier from the nearby fort, and the constant daily drama of a western town. He sat in the afternoon sun and thought about nothing in particular and felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not quite peace but was adjacent to it. When Stella came out of Aldrich's office, she walked across the plaza to where he was sitting and sat down in the chair across from him and said, "He thinks it is straightforward. The bruises, my testimony, the pattern of behavior. He has handled 3 similar cases and won all 3. He says to expect 6 to 8 weeks before the petition is granted." 6 to 8 weeks in Tucson, Calvin said. 6 to 8 weeks in Tucson, she confirmed. "I can find work. I will speak to the businesses on the main street tomorrow about bookkeeping." "I can take work too," he said. "There is always tracking work in a territorial capital." She looked at him across the small table. "We are planning as though we are staying together. Are we not?" A pause. A long, quiet pause in which the sounds of the plaza went on around them, the horses and the wagon wheels and someone somewhere beating a rug. "Yes," she said, "I suppose we are." He found work within 2 days, a contract with the county sheriff's office to track a stolen horse herd that had gone missing from a ranch east of town. Stella found work within 1 day, hired by a dry goods merchant named Fielding, who had been managing his own books badly for 2 years and recognized competence on sight. She began work on a Monday morning, arriving at Fielding's office with a sharpened pencil and a systematic approach that had the merchant's accounts in order by the end of the first week, at which point he offered her a permanent position and a salary increase. They met for dinner every evening at the hotel restaurant or at one of the smaller places around the plaza. These dinners were the best part of Calvin's days, and he was entirely aware of this. They walked after dinner sometimes, around the plaza or along the quieter residential streets where the adobe houses had courtyards with flowers beginning to bloom in the spring warmth. She told him more about Abilene, and he told her more about Kentucky. They discussed books and current affairs, and the politics of the territories and the proper way to make cornbread. a topic on which they had opposite and firmly held views that generated more sustained debate than the territory's question. On a Saturday evening in early May, 3 weeks into their stay in Tucson, they were walking along the edge of the plaza in the warm evening when she reached out and took his hand. He did not say anything. He closed his fingers around hers carefully as though something precious and recently returned had been offered to him, and they walked on in the warm Tucson night, and the air smelled of orange blossoms from someone's courtyard and the wood smoke of the evening fires, and the stars came out above the mountains one by one. "I have been thinking," she said. "You do a great deal of that," he said. "I have been thinking about what you said, in El Paso, on the balcony." "I remember what I said on the balcony," he said carefully. "I know you are not rushing me," she said. "I know you said as long as I need. I want you to know that I have been that the time has been." She stopped and tried again. "I am not afraid of you," she said. "That is the thing. I have been waiting to become afraid of you because that is what I have learned, that closeness is the approach of something dangerous, and it has not happened. I am not afraid of you." "I am very glad," he said, low and even. "I am more than not afraid," she said. "I am." She looked up at him, and the lamplight from the plaza was on her face. "I am very happy when you are near me. I think about you when you are not near me. I have thought about you since the second morning when you had the coffee ready before I woke, because that was the morning I started thinking. This man is paying attention to me as though I am worth attending to, as though what I need is a thing he wants to know." He stopped walking. She stopped too, because he was holding her hand and also because she had evidently said what she needed to say and was now waiting. "Stella," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since you ate my cornbread in Palo Verde." She laughed, that full genuine laugh that had been rare and careful at first and was neither of those things now. He looked at her laughing in the lamplight and thought that he would spend as long as he was given in this world grateful for that laugh. "The cornbread," she said. "You decided in the cornbread moment. It confirmed a process that had been building for some days," he said. "But yes, the cornbread was the moment of clarity." She stepped closer to him, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her green eyes in the lamp light. Close enough that the orange blossom smell was from her hair as much as from the courtyard. "I love you," she said, simply and directly, as she did everything. "I did not expect to be saying that to anyone for a very long time, but I love you, Calvin Keating. You strange, honest, money-burning man." He cupped her face in both hands carefully, with the deliberateness of someone who understands the weight of what they are being trusted with. He kissed her in the middle of the Tucson Plaza on a warm May evening, and it was everything a first kiss ought to be. Unhurried and cert and full of the accumulated weight of 6 weeks of fires and roads and stars and cornbread and poems read aloud in the Texas dark. When they stepped back from each other, a passing Mexican gentleman lifted his hat to them with a benevolent expression, and a small child on the steps of a shop stared at them with frank scientific interest, and the stars continued with their entirely indifferent beauty above the mountains. "I have to tell you something," Calvin said. She looked at him, steady. "When I pocketed Greer's $20 and rode out of Amarillo," he said, "I told myself I was going south to do a job. And when I found your trail heading east, I told myself I was going east because that was where the trail led. And when I sat across the fire from you that first night and looked at you and thought, I cannot take this woman back to that man, I told myself it was because of the bruises, because of plain human decency." He paused. "None of that was untrue, but it was also not the whole truth." "What is the whole truth?" she asked. "The whole truth is that I looked at you standing in that draw with a .32 and your hair down and your boots too big for your feet," he said, "and something in me that had been very quiet for a very long time woke up, and I have been following it ever since." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached up and straightened the collar of his coat with both hands, a small practical gesture that was more intimate than it had any right to be. "Well," she said, "it led you somewhere worth arriving at." The petition was granted 6 weeks later, at the end of May, in a straightforward proceeding in the territorial court that Harlan Greer did not contest, having apparently calculated that pursuing it would expose him to scrutiny he preferred to avoid. Aldrich delivered the news with professional satisfaction. Stella sat in the chair across from his desk and read the document that said, in the formal language of the territorial court, that the marriage was dissolved on grounds of cruelty, and that Stella Ramsey was her own person under the law. She was very still for a moment. And then she took a breath that was longer and deeper than the ones before it, and when she let it out she was different, incrementally but truly different, the way a door is different from a wall even though the difference looks small from a distance. She walked out of Aldrich's office and across the plaza to where Calvin was waiting, as he always waited, at the coffee stand in the sun. "It is done," she said. He stood up. He looked at her face, all of it, the green eyes and the jaw where the bruise had long since healed, and the expression that was something he had never seen on her before, something so open and unguarded, and knew that it almost took his breath away. "It is done," he said. She walked into his arms and he held her there in the middle of the Tucson Plaza, and she pressed her face against his neck and breathed, and he held on with the steady certainty of a man who has finally understood what he is for. They went to dinner that night at the best restaurant in Tucson, a place on the main street with cloth napkins and real silverware and a wine list. And Stella wore the blue calico she had made from the fabric she bought in El Paso, and she had her hair pinned up with the tortoiseshell comb. And Calvin wore his one good coat that he had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion without consciously knowing it. Over dinner, over the best meal either of them had eaten in recent memory, Calvin set his fork down and looked across the table at her and said, "I want to ask you something." She set her fork down too. She looked at him with those direct green eyes. "I am aware," he said, "that you have recently obtained the freedom to live exactly as you choose and answer to no one, and that this is a newly won thing and precious to you. I do not want to put anything in the path of that freedom." He paused. "What I want to ask is whether that freedom might at some point include marrying me. Not immediately, not unless you want immediately, but at whatever pace feels right to you. I want to marry you, Stella. I want to build a life with you somewhere that is ours. I want to wake up in the same place for more than 4 nights in a row, which is something I have not wanted in 7 years, and which I attribute entirely to your influence." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "Yes. Yes immediately, or yes at whatever pace. Yes," she said again. "Calvin, yes." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I think," she said, "that Tucson would be a fine place to start." They were married at the end of June in a small ceremony at the Adobe Church on the plaza, with the priest and Aldrich's wife as witnesses, and a delegation of the Fielding family who had become fond of Stella in the weeks she had worked for the merchant, and a handful of people who had simply wandered in because the church doors were open and a wedding was happening. Calvin wore his good coat and Stella wore a dress that she and Mrs. Aldrich had made from a cream-colored muslin that she had found in Fielding's store and pronounced exactly right for a summer morning. She walked in with her head up and her eyes clear, and found him at the altar, and the look on her face when she found him was something that settled in his chest like a warm stone and stayed there. Calvin said his vows in a clear voice and looked at her the entire time. She said hers in a voice that was equally clear and equally certain, and the priest looked rather moved, which suggested he did not see vows of that particular quality and conviction every day. They had a wedding dinner with the Aldrich family and the Fieldings, and there was cake that Mrs. Aldrich had made and a bottle of good wine that Aldrich produced with satisfaction, and there was toasting and well-wishing and the general warmth that a wedding draws from people who are happy for someone else's happiness. They wrote to Helena that evening together, the letter passing back and forth between them as they each added sentences. Stella wrote the news and Calvin wrote a paragraph introducing himself formally as her husband, which he had not previously been in a position to do, and he wrote it carefully, and with a sincerity that he thought would communicate well to a woman who was as perceptive as her sister. Helena's answering letter, which arrived 3 weeks later, was 16 pages long. The first 3 pages were pure happiness. The next 4 were detailed questions about Calvin's character, background, intentions, and prospects. The following pages were instructions for Stella about being happy and taking no nonsense from anyone, and writing regularly. The final page contained the information that Helena was expecting her first child in December. Stella read this letter in the early morning light at the small table in their rented adobe house, which they had moved into the week after the wedding, and made a sound of pure delight that brought Calvin out of the back room in his shirt sleeves to see what had happened. She handed him the letter and he read it standing by the table, and he laughed at several points, and was also, at page 6, subjected to a fairly thorough vetting that he decided he found reasonable and intended to answer fully when he wrote back. "She is going to have a baby," Stella said. "So the letter indicates," he said. "We should go for Christmas," she said, "to San Angelo, to be there when she—" "Yes," he said before she finished. "Absolutely yes." Life in Tucson settled into a shape that Calvin had not known he was capable of wanting and found that he wanted completely. He had steady work with the county, and occasionally longer contracts that took him out for a week at a time, which he did not love, but Stella approached with a practical equanimity that made the partings bearable. She had taken on full-time bookkeeping for Fieldings and for 2 additional businesses, and had quickly developed a reputation as the most reliable bookkeeper in Tucson's commercial district, which pleased her in the specific way that doing work you are genuinely good at pleases a person. Their adobe house was small and well situated, and had a courtyard in the back where Stella planted a kitchen garden with an intensity of purpose that would have done her grandmother proud. She grew tomatoes and green chilies and beans and squash and herbs, and she took a deep proprietary satisfaction in the garden that Calvin found deeply appealing because it was so completely hers, a thing she had made and tended and claimed. They had disagreements. They were 2 people with strong opinions, and they were not above an argument, and their arguments had the particular spirited quality of people who respect each other's minds enough to fight fair. They argued about cornbread unresolved, perpetually contested. They argued about the proper route for a proposed cattle road north of town. She turned out to be correct. They argued once, significantly, about money. When Calvin accepted a contract that paid well but required 2 weeks in rough country, and Stella felt he had taken it without proper consultation, and he felt she was treating him like a man who needed managing, and they were both right and both wrong, and they worked it out over the course of an evening and a good deal of honesty, and were better for having had the argument. They were happy. They were genuinely, specifically, daily happy, in the practical way that has more to do with shared life than with grand feeling, though the grand feeling was there too, in the evenings after dinner when they sat in the courtyard in the warm Tucson nights and talked, and in the early mornings when she reached across the bed and found him there, and in the moments when he came home from a week away, and she opened the door before he knocked because she had heard Copperhead's hooves on the street. In September she told him she was expecting a child. She told him in the courtyard in the early morning, before the heat of the day. She sat across from him with her coffee and said it plainly, watching his face, and his face did whatever it did because he had no management of it in that moment. She watched him go through surprise and then a flood of something that had no single name, wonder and joy and a fierce new responsibility that settled on him not heavily but cleanly, like a hand on the shoulder. "September," he said, doing arithmetic. "That would put the birth in late May," she said, "or early June." He set down his coffee cup and got up from his chair and went to her and knelt down in the courtyard with his hands on her knees and looked up at her with a face that she would remember for the rest of her life. "Stella," he said. "I know," she said, her eyes bright. "Are you well? Are you feeling?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am better than perfectly well, I am," she laughed. "I am absolutely terrified and completely happy, and I suspect those 2 things will coexist for a considerable time." "Yes," he said, "I suspect they will." They left for San Angelo in late November. A gentler journey this time, taking the stage road where they could and making the trip in stages over 2 weeks, stopping at proper hotels where Stella could sleep in a real bed, and he could fuss over her comfort in the ways that she alternately found touching and maddening. "I am expecting a child not made of glass," she told him firmly when he attempted to carry both their bags from a hotel in El Paso. "I am aware of the distinction," he said, carrying both bags anyway. "Calvin, Stella." She gave him a look that was also, unmistakably, a suppressed smile and walked ahead into the hotel. They arrived in San Angelo on the first Saturday of December, to find Helena enormous with the near end of her pregnancy, and beaming with a happiness that matched Stella's own. And the reunion of the two sisters was something Calvin and Porter Dawes watched from the side with a mutual satisfaction that went unspoken, because it did not need to be spoken. The four of them spent 3 weeks together on the farm, and they were 3 of the best weeks Calvin could remember. The work of the farm in the early winter, the rhythm of it, the mornings with coffee and the evenings with conversation, and the deep satisfaction of a house full of people who loved each other. Helena's son was born on the 18th of December, a large and healthy boy with a considerable opinion of the world that he expressed in clear terms from the first moment. He was named James after Porter's father, and he was an immediate and overwhelming success with his Aunt Stella, who held him with the fierce, tender wonder of a woman who was carrying her own child and feeling the doubled weight of it. Calvin held him too that first evening, while the women rested, and Porter sat beside him, and they both looked at the new person in Calvin's arms, and James looked back at them with the profound, unfocused seriousness of the newly born. "It changes things," Porter said. "Yes," Calvin said, "I imagine it does." He looked down at James and thought about the spring, about May or June, about a child that was half him and half Stella, and the thought was enormous and warm, and he let himself have it fully. They went home to Tucson in January, back to their adobe and the winter-quiet courtyard, and the months of the new year moved with a fullness that the previous years had never had. Stella's belly rounded through the spring, and she continued working through March, slowing in April at her own insistence and Fielding's concerned encouragement, until by May she was home with the garden and the house, and a growing stack of knitting that had begun to take on baby-shaped dimensions. The labor began on a Tuesday evening in the last week of May, which was appropriately dramatic, and the local midwife, a capable and unflappable woman named Mrs. Ramos, who had delivered most of the babies in Tucson's residential district, arrived and took charge of the situation with a calm authority that Calvin was extremely grateful for. He was in the front room for what felt like a very long time, and Mrs. Ramos's assistant came out occasionally to report that things were progressing normally and that he should stop wearing a track in the floorboards, and he tried to sit down and was largely unsuccessful. At 4 in the morning on a Wednesday, Mrs. Ramos opened the bedroom door and said, "Mr. Keating, come and meet your son." He crossed the room in about 2 steps. Stella was tired in a way that went beyond ordinary tiredness, the deep physical used-up tiredness of having done something enormous, and she was more beautiful than he had ever seen her, which he had not thought possible. She was sitting against the pillows with their son in her arms, and she looked up at him when he came in, and her face was so open and so full that he had to stop in the doorway for a moment. He went to the bed and sat on the edge and looked at his son, who was very small and very new, and was making small sounds that communicated a great deal. "He is perfect," Calvin said. "He is," Stella agreed. She sounded dazed and joyful in equal measure. "He has your ears." Calvin looked at the ears. "Those are entirely dignified ears." "I did not say they were not dignified," she said. "I said they were yours." He laughed, his forehead dropping briefly to her shoulder, and she laughed too, that full, genuine laugh that had been rare in a draw in West Texas and was entirely natural now in this room, in this life they had built. "What do we call him?" she asked. They had talked about names through the long, slow months, but had not arrived at a final choice. Each proposal met with consideration, and then revised. He looked at the small face and said, "James," half to himself, thinking of Porter Dawes's boy in San Angelo. "James," she repeated. "James Keating." She looked at the baby. "James, hello, James." James opened his eyes briefly and regarded them both with an expression of dignified assessment. "He approves," Calvin said. "He is reserving judgment," Stella said, "which I think is wise." He stayed beside her until she slept, which was not long. He sat in the chair by the bed, with James in his arms after Mrs. Ramos had done what needed doing and gone, and he sat in the early morning quiet of the Tucson house and listened to his wife breathe and felt his son's weight in his arms and thought about the whole long road that had brought him here. A Tuesday morning in Amarillo, a bounty notice and a $20 bill, a draw in the red West Texas scrubland, and a woman with a .32 caliber revolver and her hair down, the button in the red dust, the burned money, the road east and south and then west, the fire and the poems and the stars. He thought about what it meant to make the right choice. Not the convenient choice, not the sensible choice by the arithmetic of money and ease, but the right one. He had made it by instinct, or something deeper than instinct, and it had led him here, to this room, to this weight in his arms, to this woman sleeping in the morning quiet. He wrote to his brother Thaddeus in Kentucky the following week, a longer letter than he usually wrote, with news of James and Stella and the life in Tucson, and Thaddeus wrote back 6 weeks later with warmth and considerable teasing about the fact that it had taken Calvin until the age of 33 to settle down, and an invitation to bring the family to Kentucky someday, which Calvin read aloud to Stella, and she said she would very much like to see Kentucky, and he thought perhaps they would. He wrote to Helena and Porter with the news, and received a letter back in Helena's hand that was nearly as long as the wedding letter and considerably more tearful in tone, in the happy way. That summer in Tucson was the best summer of Calvin's life, and he knew it while he was in it, which was the best kind of knowing. He worked and came home. Stella worked part-time from home now, reviewing accounts that Fielding sent over, and tended her garden, which in the late summer abundance was producing more tomatoes and chilies than any 2 people and 1 infant could reasonably consume, and she distributed the excess to neighbors with the generosity that was native to her. James grew from a small new person to a larger, louder, more opinionated one, with a speed that astonished them both, and that Stella documented in letters to Helena, with a detail and affection that made for wonderful reading. He had dark hair from somewhere in Calvin's ancestry and green eyes that were entirely his mother's, and he had the quality of paying close attention that Calvin recognized from his own tracking, which he found secretly very pleasing. On a September evening, a year and 3 months after they had arrived in Tucson, they were sitting in the courtyard after dinner in the late warmth, James asleep in the carry basket between them, and the stars were coming out above the adobe walls, and the mountains were dark purple on the horizon. Stella had her feet tucked under her in the chair and a cup of tea in her hands and her hair loose, the way it always was in the evenings now, the way he loved it. She was looking at the first stars with an expression of complete contentment. "Calvin," she said, he said, "I have been thinking. A dangerous enterprise," he said, as he always did. "I want to go back to Texas someday," she said. "Not to Amarillo, never to Amarillo, but to the land, the Caprock country. I have been thinking about it all summer. I miss the red earth." He looked at her. "We could find land," he said, "good land east of here or south, near the Pecos maybe. We could build something." "A ranch," she said. "A ranch," he agreed. "With a proper kitchen garden," she said, "obviously, and enough room for Helena and Porter and James to visit." "James the elder," he said, looking at the basket. "James the elder," she confirmed, smiling. "We could do that," he said. "We could begin planning it." She looked at him across the courtyard in the evening light, his wife, this woman who had stood in a draw with a .32 caliber revolver and her hair down and her boots too big, and had changed the entire direction of his life, and her expression was the one he loved best, the full, open, unguarded one that she gave him now without thought because she trusted him with it entirely. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. "More than any reasonable man ought to love any person, I suspect, but I have made my peace with being unreasonable on this particular point." She laughed, and James stirred in the basket at the sound and made a small, interested noise. "He agrees," Stella said. "He is reserving judgment," Calvin said. "He is wise," she said, "like his father." He got up from his chair and went to her, and she moved her feet so he could sit beside her, and she leaned into him with the easy, natural weight of someone who has found where they belong, and his arm went around her, and the night came down warm and full of stars over the mountains. 2 years later, on a morning of clean blue sky in the early autumn of 1880, Calvin Keating and Stella Keating loaded a wagon in front of their Tucson adobe for the last time, with James, now 2 and extremely verbal, sitting on the wagon seat investigating everything within reach. They had bought a section of land in the hill country south of the Pecos, good land with a creek and native grasses, and a stand of live oak that Stella had described in a letter to Helena as the most beautiful thing she had seen since the mountains around Tucson. Calvin had built most of the house himself over the previous summer on a series of extended trips, with local help and Porter Dawes, who had come out for 2 weeks in July and proved an excellent carpenter. It was a solid house, stone and cedar, with a wide porch facing east toward the sunrise and a back room with southern windows where the light was good for reading and for keeping books. The neighbors, the ranching families within 15 miles, were honest, hardworking people who asked no questions about the past and gave and received help freely, the way the frontier required. The nearest town was a day's ride but had a general store and a doctor and a church and a school that James would eventually attend. They drove the wagon west to east, back across the country they had traveled years before in the other direction, and Stella sat beside him on the wagon seat with her face turned into the wind, the same wind that blew across the Caprock and the Llano and the whole immensity of the Texas plains, and she looked at it with the clear green eyes that still, after all this time, did not miss very much. "Home," she said, when they turned off the main road onto the track that led to their land, and the word landed simply and solidly and was exactly the right word. James pointed at a longhorn cattle grazing near the fence line and announced it in the emphatic terms of a 2-year-old who takes naming things very seriously. Calvin reined the horses to a stop so the boy could look properly. "Cow," Stella confirmed. "Big cow," James said, with great satisfaction. "He has his priorities in order," Calvin said. "He has your eye for the important details," she said. He looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was everything. The whole long road and every campfire and the burned $20 and the blue calico and the courtyard in Tucson and James sleeping in the basket under the stars, and all of it distilled into this moment on a wagon track in the Texas hill country in the autumn of 1880, with home visible at the end of the road and the whole future waiting. He picked up the reins. The horses leaned into the trace. The wagon moved forward. And Stella Keating, who had stood alone in a draw with bad boots and a loaded revolver, and the whole terrifying expanse of freedom ahead of her, leaned her shoulder against her husband's shoulder and looked at the house at the end of the road, and was entirely, wholly, perfectly home. In the years that followed, the ranch grew steadily under their careful hands. A second child came 2 years after they settled, a daughter they named Rose, who arrived in the spring like everything good arrived in Texas, with great color and noise and an immediate strong opinion about the world. She had her father's eyes and her mother's stubbornness, which Calvin privately felt was an excellent combination, though he was careful about saying so within Stella's hearing. James grew from a small, emphatic boy into a larger, emphatic boy who could already read at 5, and who followed his father around the ranch, with the same intense attention that Calvin had once given to reading trails. He was good with horses in the way that some children simply are, naturally and without instruction, climbing up onto Copperhead's broad back at age 4 in a moment that stopped Calvin's heart briefly before the old horse, simply stood very still as though he had been expecting it. Copperhead grew old on that ranch with the dignity appropriate to a horse who had carried 2 people across most of Texas and part of Arizona in the service of love. He was retired from riding work before James was old enough to ride properly, and spent his final years in the best pasture near the creek, investigating the grass with the thorough professionalism of a horse who takes his food seriously. He died on a January morning of old age, peacefully, and Calvin buried him by the creek in the live oak shade, and stood there for a while in the cold morning, which Stella understood and did not comment on, only came out later with coffee and stood beside him quietly. Helena and Porter came to visit in the summers. Their James and the Keating James were 3 months apart in age and of one mind about most things, which was both useful for their mothers and periodically alarming for everyone else in the vicinity. Helena and Stella sat on the porch in the summer evenings and talked for hours, and Calvin and Porter sat nearby and talked about cattle and weather, and occasionally looked at their respective wives with an identical expression of simple gratitude that neither man commented on to the other, but that both of them lived with daily. Thaddeus came from Kentucky once in the spring of 1883 with his wife Margaret and their 3 children, and Margaret and Stella became instant friends over the kitchen table, and Thaddeus walked the land with Calvin on the second morning and said, with the particular bluntness of brothers, "You look better than I have ever seen you." "I feel better than I have ever been," Calvin said. Thaddeus looked at the house, at the garden already showing green behind it, at Stella visible in the kitchen window. "She did that," he said. "We did it," Calvin said. Thaddeus nodded with the satisfied air of a man whose assessment of a situation has been confirmed. "Then you did well," he said. "Both of you." There was a period, not spoken about in great detail and not dramatized, when Harlan Greer's name came up once more, years after Tucson, when word reached them through Helena that Greer had died in Amarillo in the winter of 1882, of a liver complaint that surprised no one who had known his habits. Stella received this information with a quietness that lasted a full afternoon, and Calvin did not intrude on it. That evening she said, "I do not feel what I expected to feel." "What do you feel?" "Nothing much," she said with a careful honesty. "I suppose I expected grief or anger or relief. I feel something quieter than any of those things." Like a door closing on a room I had already left, she was quiet for a moment. "Is that strange?" "No," he said. "I think that is what healing looks like from the inside. It looks like distance." She nodded slowly. Then she looked at him with those green eyes. "I am very glad you burned that bounty notice," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." "Every day," she raised an eyebrow. "Every day," he confirmed. "Sometimes multiple times a day." She smiled at him and shook her head in the particular way that meant she found him deeply ridiculous and also entirely loved, and went back to her book. And that was the last time Harlan Greer was spoken of in that house. Rose's first word was not mama or papa, but more, delivered with one pointing finger at the bowl of applesauce on the kitchen table, which Stella found both impressive and entirely characteristic. She grew up with her brother and with the land, and with 2 parents who were wildly in love with each other, and made no particular effort to conceal it, which she and James considered intermittently embarrassing and fundamentally reassuring in equal measure. The ranch became one of the better operations in the hill country, known for good cattle and honest dealing, and a bunkhouse where the hands were treated fairly and the cook was excellent. Calvin never entirely gave up tracking, but the work became occasional and local, mostly stolen cattle that neighboring ranchers hired him to find, and he rode out on those jobs with the same quiet, methodical attention he had always brought to the work, and came home to a house where the lamp was lit in the window. He was very good at coming home. In the spring of 1886, Stella added a second room to the back of the house, planning ahead for what she said, with complete matter-of-fact certainty, was going to be necessary. Calvin looked at her. "Are you telling me?" "I am telling you we need another room," she said, in the tone that was her most innocent, which was always slightly dangerous. Stella, yes, Calvin. Are you expecting again? She looked at him with those green eyes and her slight smile. I thought a tracker of your reputation would have noticed already. You have been deliberately obfuscating. I prefer the word private, she said. He crossed the room and took her face in his hands the way he always had, and kissed her the way he always did, unhurried and certain. And she kissed him back and pressed her hand flat against his chest, and he felt his heart under her palm, going at the pace that love and years and daily happiness had given it. Their third child, another son, arrived in the October of that year and was named Thomas, which was Stella's father's name, and which she had been saving, she told him, since before she knew there would be a Thomas to give it to. Thomas arrived with a great deal of energy and settled almost immediately into an expression of interested alertness that suggested he intended to pay close attention to everything, which Calvin found gratifying. He stood in the bedroom doorway that October evening with Stella resting, and the baby asleep beside her and James and Rose peering around him with the wide-eyed solemnity appropriate to the occasion, and he looked at all of it, the whole accumulated beautiful, ordinary, specific life of it, and felt something that was not one thing but many things, gratitude and love and wonder, and a deep animal gladness at being exactly where he was. Outside, the Texas autumn was doing what it did, the sky going enormous and gold and the wind in the live oak moving like water, and somewhere out on the south pasture the cattle were quiet in the evening, and the creek was running clear and cold over limestone, and the garden was finished for the year, its good work done and resting. Calvin Keating, who had been a man moving between places without a specific reason to stay anywhere, stood in the doorway of the house he had built on the land he had chosen, and thought about the button in the red dust and the $20 and the match he had held to the edge of a paper until the heat reached his fingers. Some choices looked like losses at the time. They turned out to be the whole world. He put his arm around James and lifted Rose and went into the room, and Stella opened her eyes and looked at him with the face he loved best of all the faces in the world, open and whole and entirely, freely, fully his. Thomas, she said, looking at the baby. Thomas, he agreed. And outside, the Texas wind moved through the live oak, and the stars came out above the caprock one by one, the same stars that had watched over every fire and every road and every mile of the long good journey that had begun with a bounty notice and $20, and a man on a red roan horse making the one choice that turned out to be right. The story did not end there, because stories like this do not end. They continue in the particular and daily way of real things, in the mornings when the coffee is ready, and the light comes in the east windows, and the children are still asleep, and two people sit together in the comfortable silence of those who have learned to be still with each other. In the evenings when the work is done and the porch is cool and the conversation goes wherever it wants to go, through everything and nothing, easy and full, they continued. They were happy. They were home.